Thank you for joining us for MIT Sloan Alumni Online. We are bringing you conversations with principled, innovative leaders who improve the world, and we're joined today by Hiram Samel, Sloan Fellows, class of 2006, and PhD class of 2013. Professor Samel is a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He teaches global strategy, scenario planning, and GoLab. Today, we'll hear more about his work, teaching, and research, and we are thrilled to hear more about his new course at MIT, Building and Using Imagined Futures, Thinking Forward in a Post-Global World. For our viewers, we'll have some slides and conversation and prepared questions from Jackie and Hiram, and then we'll also have time for questions from the audience. So you can either drop those into the chat, or you can use the Q&A feature in your Zoom interface. And thank you so much, Jackie and Hiram. I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Greg. And again, big thank you to the Sloan Office of External Relations for your partnership on this series. And thank you all for joining us today. As Greg noted, it is a sincere pleasure to welcome Hiram to share his insight and expertise with us today. In addition to his research on comparative political economy, technology strategy, the economics of innovation, and labor studies, Hiram was also an entrepreneur, building and leading companies that operated into over 20 countries, including emerging economies. So naturally, his work at MIT draws upon these experiences and more. And anyone like myself who was lucky enough to study under him can attest that his teachings are as thought-provoking as they are actionable. And our session that we prepared today is actually no different. So Hiram, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your insights with us today.
Jackie, great to be here, and hello to everyone. And I have to say, if you're not in Cambridge, it's a beautiful day here. So I certainly can sympathize if you're watching from outside. It's about 70 degrees, which in April is pretty good. It's about as good as it gets here. So yeah, Jackie was a student of mine, so it's great to see her back. I see a few alumni. I see actually Epa Rixey, my TA for this course. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of a course I've crafted together from something. So I'm a second career academic. I came back to Sloan as a Sloan Fellow part-time, what they call Flex, which is a precursor to the EMBA program, and graduated in 2006, but I was here for 2 years. And actually enjoyed it so much, I came back and got a PhD at the same time as running a company. And my first academic posting was to Oxford, where I kind of came across scenario planning. So part of this is what I've learned at Oxford, and part of it is sort of how I'm now applying it to a larger framework in terms of global strategy. So I teach the EMBAs, both global strategy, and now I do a scenario planning elective, and thinking about a way that I can put it together, because in many ways what I discovered from running companies is that often, as much as we'd like to think that we know what's going to be in the future, we really don't. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone that is looking at the political environment now. If you had asked someone 10 years ago what would it look like, you might not have imagined it now. You might not have even 3 years ago. And so scenario planning is just sort of a way that you can kind of think about the future in a manner that will help you kind of encounter things that you might not rationally think of. And so I thought I'd start with that. Jackie, is there something I want to show a short video. So the program I have for you is kind of show a short video. Jackie and I will have a conversation, or maybe Jackie, you might have a question first. I want to show a short video from Dr. Strangelove. Maybe some of you have seen this movie. I'll explain a little bit more before I play it. And then we'll have a conversation. Then I'm going to show you some slides, because my goal is in this, whatever 45 minutes we have, is to basically show you how you can do this yourself, because imagining futures is literally just that. It's imagining futures. It's basically a way to think about the future in a manner that's helpful to you without judgment or bias, and that often incorporates working with other people. And the most important thing to understand about scenario planning is actually it's a process. It's not a result. And so you get scenarios as a result, but it's really a mindset. And for some of you that might be on this call, you might have used scenarios before, and some companies and some governments are prodigious users of them. But oftentimes they just sit in a drawer. People will do it and they'll sit in a drawer, and that's not what the goal of this is. The goal of the exercise is to help you think about uncertainty and think about different environments, and how they can change and how those changes affect you. And I will say that having a Sloan education makes a huge difference because most of you have had system dynamics. And system dynamics, you understand the concept of reinforcing and balancing loops. And you understand not only first order effects, but second order effects. And things that surprise us in the world often are not first order effects, but often second order effects, sort of what happens as the result of something else happening. The scenarios are a way for you to get there.
Well, Hiram, that was a perfect introduction to our discussion today. So I think it actually makes sense for us to go ahead with the video first, please.
Okay,
Thank you.
let me share the video and then we'll come back and talk about that for a little bit. So this is a scene from Dr. Strangelove. It's a 64 movie. This is one of Stanley Kubrick's earliest movies. It's a story about a rogue Air Force general that attacks Russia. Here's Peter Sellers playing one of his 3 roles. You'll see George C. Scott and Peter Bull in this as well. And then I'll come back and tell you why I've shown this. So hopefully this will work for you and you can hear it.
I've done as you asked. Be careful, Mr. President. I think he's drunk.
Hello? Hello, Dimitri. Listen, I can't hear too well. Do you suppose you could turn the music down just a little? Oh, that's much better. Yeah. Yeah. Fine, I can hear you now, Dimitri. Clear and plain and coming through fine. I'm coming through fine too, eh? Good, then. Well, then, as you say, we're both coming through fine. Good. Well, it's good that you're fine and I'm fine. I agree with you. It's great to be fine. Now then, Dimitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb. The bomb, Dimitri. The hydrogen bomb. Well, now, what happened is one of our base commanders, he had a sort of, well, he went a little funny in the head. You know, just a little funny. And he went and did a silly thing. Well, I'll tell you what he did. He ordered his planes to attack your country. Well, let me finish, Dimitri. Let me finish, Dimitri. Well, listen, how do you think I feel about it? Can you imagine how I feel about it, Dimitri? Why do you think I'm calling you? Just to say hello? Of course I like to speak to you. Of course I like to say hello. Not now, but anytime, Dimitri. I'm just calling up to tell you something terrible has happened. It's a friendly call. Of course it's a friendly call. Listen, if it wasn't friendly, you probably wouldn't have even got it. They will not reach their targets for at least another hour. I am positive, Dimitri. Listen, I've been all over this with your ambassador. It is not a trick. Well, I'll tell you, we'd like to give your air staff a complete rundown on the targets, the flight plans, and the defensive systems of the planes. Yes, I mean, if we're unable to recall the planes, then I'd say that, we're just gonna have to help you destroy them, Dimitri. I know there are boys. All right, well, listen, now who should we call? Who should we call, Dimitri? The people, sorry, you faded away there. The People's Central Air Defense Headquarters. Where is that, Dimitri? In Ops, right? Yes. Oh, you're calling first, will you? Uh-huh. Listen, do you happen to have a phone number on you, Dimitri? What? I see. Just ask for Omsk information. I'm sorry too, Dimitri. I'm very sorry. All right, you're sorrier than I am, but I am sorry as well. I am as sorry as you are, Dimitri. Don't say that you're more sorry than I am, because I'm capable of being just as sorry as you are. So we're both sorry, all right? All right.
All right, so you can see this is the short setting of Dr. Strangelove, and this is a movie that came out in January of 1964. So it was actually due to be released in right around Thanksgiving in 1963, but given the fact that Kennedy was assassinated, the producers held the movie back a little bit. And this was, essentially at the height of the Cold War. You can imagine this. And so if you were in front of me and I was to ask you, I'd say, how plausible a future could you imagine this? And people might say, knowing now, well, we've been through the Cold War, we understand this. But in reality, this was quite a plausible future. The irony of all of this is actually at this time, base commanders had full autonomy over nuclear weapons in the United States. And so at that point, there was the intent of having centralized command. Base commanders could indeed do what General Jack Ripper indeed did in the movie. And this is what this movie was, as a satire, was kind of basically produced to develop this. And if you can recall the picture I showed you of Dr. Strangelove in that slide, that was a man named Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn worked at Rand Corporation. If you're out in Santa Monica, you probably know Rand well. You might hear it in the kind of great American acronyms. RAND stands for Research and Development, hence RAND. And he was tasked with thinking the unthinkable, and basically a way for him to come up with how to convince people that we had a problem. And what Peter Sellers did was to translate that into a movie. And in many ways, people cannot think the unthinkable without looking to something beyond just data. They can't do this rationally. And for folks like us that are trained at Sloan, where we live very much in a world of data, scenarios are quite a bit the antithesis to that. It's a way to think about something qualitatively. And that's what the task of scenarios is the exact opposite of what we do at Sloan, is to get yourself to imagine this kind of environment, a way to sort of think about that.
So, Hiram, could you explain a little bit more about how you go about imagining a future scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'll show you some ways to think about it, but the first thing you have to do is you have to don't think of it the way that you might if you kind of think about basically probability. So if you think about futures, I mean, there's essentially three futures. Most of the futures that we live in is kind of what I call the world of insurance, which is you have probabilistic risk. What you can do as you gather more information, you can change the probabilities, and you can sort of assign a expected value to what your options are. This is what we would teach you, for example, if you were taking real options. The second thing is kind of what we also teach you is sort of what we'll call novelty, novel innovation or invention, things that you can't imagine, but could occur. Fusion energy, for example, things that kind of you can think about in the future, things that kind of will happen. But the most important one is what we'll call is kind of a third type of future. And those are kind of feral futures. Those are things where you don't really understand the second order effects. And, classic examples of that is when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the CIA armed, at that time they were called the Mujahideen. And of course, the Mujahideen, as we know, morphed into the Taliban. And then we ended up sending our own troops to fight troops that we had armed in the first place. You can think through the financial crisis. You can think of when Lehman Brothers went broke, the follow-on effects that happened in financial markets and how the government had to step in to prop up the financial system. I mean, you can think of a variety of these things. And the goal of scenarios is to help you think of primarily the second and the third kind of future, not so much the first, because we have that. And if it's okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you a few more slides, and then we'll continue the conversation, Jackie. Does that sound all right?
That's perfect. Thank you. So
I want you sort of to think about this and sort of, when you think about this, so this happens to be the forecast planning right before the financial crash in May 2008. It's always fun to poke fun at economists. That's our job as social scientists that aren't economists, because they hold a high status. But these were the forecasts basically about 4 or 5 months before the financial crisis. As you can see, nothing came close to what was going on. This is something that I love in politics. This is around the 2020 elections. And this is what I would say is pretty much typical when people rely upon data, this is just a quote from at the time. This is Sherry Bustos that was running the the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And I won't read it to you, but it's basically saying that essentially we were completely wrong because everything we listen to, Senate polls, our polls, government polls, president polls, public polls, turnout modeling, all pointed to one political environment, and that environment never materialized. And so what I want to suggest to you is actually you can, in your own mind, you can find a way to create that. And I'm going to help you do that as kind of we work our way through the session, but I want to show you a couple other things. And so essentially, when I teach this, I generally won't show this with the little curve. I'll just ask people where most people are. I also, luckily and very happily, teach the spouses of, or the partners of folks that come to the Sloan Fellows program and ask them where their partners are. And of course, they always put them in the familiar and comfort box, but the actual students like to think they're somewhere else. But most executives tend to live in the comfort and familiar box. And the whole point of scenarios is to get people into a place that's uncomfortable, get them into the unfamiliar and uncomfortable, and so that they're at least comfortable with the unfamiliar. And that's almost impossible to do with just using data because you're going to have sort of confirmation bias. You'll have a whole sort of behavioral biases that you'll have. And the goal is to kind of get beyond that. And so when you think of scenarios, it's completely the antithesis to what how we use data. And so simplest way to think about this is the past is from behind us. And if you think about Faulkner's great line where, you know, the past is not history, the past is, it's not even dead. It comes with us as we move forward. But at the same time, the future comes at us. It's like coming at us through a windshield in a way that you can think about that. And the goal of scenarios is to kind of a disciplined method to come up with different, in essence, screens, views out of your windshield of the future coming at you, ways that you can do that. And they're mental maps. And so the goal is to create these mental maps in your head of a world that you thought you couldn't imagine. And I'll show you a few of them. Normally in a course, it's always a workshop. If you're interested in scenarios, it's important that you get a variety of people together to do it. You want to do this with a group of people that have diverse points of view, and generally people that don't necessarily agree with you. Ways that you can think about it, because you want to get this diversity of opinions to sort of almost, it's almost a polemical exercise, a way to kind of tease apart things to get at worlds that you might not even remotely think about. And ways that you can think about that is that normally when you have a rare event, this happens to be a slide for crises, you tend to kind of always engage in wishful thinking. There may be many people in this environment that we have now that might be engaged in wishful thinking. There may be many people that think differently and think that it's okay. The goal of scenario planning is not to be normative. It's not to have a judgment and not a way to do this. And so I see something in the text that says the slides are not fitting. Is that, Jackie, can you see the slides?
I can see them. Well, this shows only the slide. So is that clear?
Is that better from someone that, and this is just coming in the chat I saw. Okay, so we'll leave that then there if that's okay. And so basically the whole goal of having a crisis often is that you learn from it because it's discontinuous in ways that you can see that. So the future is not the same as the past. And the goal of scenarios is to pay attention to possibilities. I'm going to show you a little bit what I call a futures cone in a second, ways that you can think about this, but you don't want to go nuts with this. You don't necessarily want to be predicting asteroids hitting Earth. You want to just think about plausible futures, but you'll be surprised how much can be plausible if you actually think about that. And the other thing is that makes this easy to do is you don't need more data. Basically, an uncertain future by definition has no data. If you had data, you'd be putting probabilities on it. And so you don't necessarily have to have that. And the benefit of scenarios is they're disposable. So you come up with scenarios. I don't have a ton of time today, but I'll try to help you sort of think through how you might have, if you're a business, you might have a strategy. By the way, I should say that people use these for all sorts of things. When we had this in a class, students would use this for career planning. Students will use this for all sorts of reasons other than just sort of, how is my business going to be affected by this? Or if you happen to have a hospital, but you can, you can start to think about multiple ways that there are these forces coming from what I'm going to call the contextual environment. I'll explain that to you in a few minutes. Ways that you can do that. And the benefit of scenarios is you can do all this upfront. It's ex ante. It doesn't cost you anything other than your time. They're disposable, and you can do multiple ones. And oftentimes when you're asked to predict something or to do something, you often will do it. You have to think about your audience. The benefit of scenarios is you just do it amongst yourself, and then you can take it to people to do this. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that. And so I'm going to show you, I think, 2 examples I have here, and then I'm going to come back to you, Jackie, and we can chat some more. And then I'll show folks how to do scenarios. So this was a EMBA student that took my class. At the time, he was the chief financial officer for a security subsidiary of Stanley Black & Decker. And they had a relatively large investment in security, but he was concerned about their ability to stay the course in that because they were not a technology business. And he felt that there were other companies that had more means and more desire and quite honestly more access to capital to be in this space. But the challenge he had is he needed to convince the board of this. And so we needed a tool to be able to do this because he could discuss this. He wasn't sure how to do this. And so he took my course. And then he started to say, okay, well, I can start to do scenarios. And so he came up with these scenarios. He basically sort of talked about different ways that the world can be. And, this went from kind of back in my day, which is essentially is that, this is really about hardware, all the way over to, the opposite way, which is really more what it is now, the Netflix of security, where it's basically, security as a service. The hardware is commoditized and the service offering is in the software. We see this all the time. And then he had kind of 2 intermediate places where this was. And he kind of went through this, presented an exercise to the board. And then result is the board sold the unit for $3.2 billion. So it was a reasonable recovery for Black & Decker. But it was something that the company didn't really want to sell, but he kind of had a better understanding of what the future was, and that it would have taken a lot for them to compete in that business. And I think it was a successful exit for that. And then here is what I'll call the futures cone. So what did he do is he didn't go and predict a world that doesn't exist. He basically said that knowing with current knowledge what could happen. That's what scenarios are. You don't do the preposterous. You don't even do the possible. You stick to the plausible. You don't want to do the projected future because that's normative. And you don't want to do the preferable because that's even more normative. In a sense that this is what you want to happen. The projected future is often just what your confirmation bias is, what your data is going to be. So you want to come up with these stories of what the thing is. And so everything he did here was essentially he had access to this information. This was not like he was making this up. It was something that he had access to. He felt it was comfortable. The time horizon here was about 5 years. It's important to understand when you do scenarios is that you have a user. This is a very specific user. This was Stanley Black & Decker in the security business and what the future of security is. And what one person does for scenarios versus another one, they'll have completely different scenarios because each of you come from a different perspective and you have different outcomes and different objectives. And it's important to remember that. And so I'm going to show you everyone quickly, and then I'll come back to you, Jackie. This is sort of a scenario to the way that I teach it. This is a question for essentially the urban area in Denver. You may know it. So Denver is on the east side of the Rockies, but the water drains on the Rockies onto the west side. And so it can be relatively dry in Denver, at least in terms of water table. And it's an area that has been growing a lot. And so the urban sort of authorities, or the water authority of I guess, or urban Denver, said, you know, how do we plan for this? How do we think about that? And what they noticed is that when people come to Denver, they build single-family homes. They're not living in apartments. They're not living in multifamilies. They're building single-family homes, and then a smaller amount, but much more dominant than any of the ever means, are living in larger single-family homes. And the problem with those is they're huge water users. Single-family homes are the largest users of water, and if they keep on building single-family homes, they're going to have a challenge with building these homes. And so they went out and they put together a sort of a group of individuals from all sorts of walks of life, business leaders, community leaders, regular citizens, and kind of said, oh, you know, what are the things that we need to do? What are the things that we need to plan for? How can we think through what our options can be? How can we do this? And they essentially came up with this. And this is a 2x2 matrix. I'm going to show you how to do this in a few minutes. That basically asks the question, how can I come up with 4 different scenarios, ways that I can do that? And you basically come up with 2, what I'll call forces. And I'll tell you a little bit how to do that in a second. And these ones were very simple, which was economic health. So if you live in Denver or know Denver, it's always had a history of boom and bust. It's changed a little bit now. It has more of a med ed and a tech presence, but it was always a resource-based economy in Colorado. And that people move to Colorado for lifestyle preferences. And often those lifestyle preferences are you know, basically to live out in, you know, a single family home. And that sometimes people were now talking about 15-minute cities, and they might want to live closer. And so they kind of said, well, how can we think about that? And they essentially came up with 4 different scenarios. And those scenarios are where people are living together in a vibrant economy. And that's going to be much easier on their water usage. Or people are going to be living much more compact, but then the economy is not so good. This is kind of what you might think of as urban blight. This is living on a prayer. And then vice versa, sort of suburban revival sort of things are good, but people really want to stay in the country. That's going to be a big burden on their water system. It's going to raise their tax rates. And then, of course, the worst of both is when you have sluggish sprawl, ways that you can think about that. And so that just allowed the sort of development folks to sort of think through the city ways that they can do that. So here's a scenario example. That's one for essentially not a business, but for an organization. I'm going to come back to this one in a second. And I'll come here and sort of talk to Jackie for a few minutes. I'm going to show you one more, and then I'm going to show you how to do these things.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Hiram. So as you've highlighted in the last several examples that it's important to think about each of these scenarios in context. But you've also maintained, and we've discussed, that reframing or kind of rethinking preconceived notions helps people to do this. So could you elaborate on that a bit more and offer any advice on how to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very, I mean, this is you know, a topic that is certainly you read about all the time now, given the political polarization that exists in the United States. But it's essentially trying to look at things from multiple perspectives. And so scenarios, it's important to do this. And this is what Imagined Futures are, because this is why it's important for you to come back and get a diverse group of people to talk to. You need people that have a different perspective from yours. Oftentimes, in class, for example, I'll show a picture of the Taj Mahal. That will be, you know, if you've been to the Taj Mahal and you're in the garden, you're in the front. I mean, the Taj Mahal is one of those buildings that, quite frankly, is more beautiful than it is in photographs. It's an amazing, amazing place. But oftentimes, depending on what the water is like in the Ganges, you know, if you're on the other side of the river, you might just see a whole bunch of trash piled up because parts of that may not be so wealthy. And so it's important to see things from multiple points of view. And it's important that you do that. It's important that you get a diverse group of people that don't agree with you, because you're going to start saying to yourself, how do we identify forces to do that? And that's probably this is why scenarios are most effective as a process. It's a learning process. It's a way to build mental models. It's a way to think about the world that divorces you from your everyday data ways to sort of think about what's happened in the past. And to free your mind up, but to do it in a disciplined enough manner where people can learn from it, and that you can tell stories. And In class, for example, we help people build stories, because if people are going to give you news, this is why I showed you Dr. Strangelove. I mean, if you said to someone, "Oh, there's going to be some rogue base commander," I mean, you're going to go to the New York Times or the Washington Post or some newspaper of record back then, that you're going to hear something from some Air Force general, as Curtis LeMay said. So that's never going to happen. We have complete control over that. And so then you kind of leaves your mind, you don't think about it. But when you see it in a movie and you say, I guess, could this really happen? It at least makes it real enough for you. It's plausible enough that you start to say, oh, maybe that's something that I need to think about. And the next example is exactly one of those kind of cases.
Mhm. Well, in building upon that a little bit, you discussed that it's important to kind of think critically about the conviction of experts. Could you talk a little bit more about why that's so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually have some slides. I think I did have some slides in here. Let me see if I have them at some point, but I'll show them to you. But basically, I think that people here, they're alumni. I think they've been enough experts in their life to know that they're not always right. And it doesn't mean that they're wrong all the time either, or they can't be helpful. They can be helpful, but it's kind of like what we think about of models when you teach models is in many ways. I'd like to say that, many models are maybe not be right, but at least they're useful. And so the same thing that you might want to think about with experts is that some of them might be helpful, but, I think that, a lot of the voters in the United States, for example, voted for Trump, not so much because they like Trump, but because of the way that they find themselves in a world that was in essence run by experts. And that doesn't mean the experts were wrong. It just means that people have a perception of them that's different. And I think if you acknowledge that and you do scenarios that take that into view, you'll get a better understanding of the way that the world people think about it. And in particular, if you have a business and you might say, how can I be impacted by that? If you have a business where you were raising capital, or you had outsourced a whole bunch of production somewhere, and you say to yourself, I never thought of what was going to happen if the US and China got involved in a Cold War. I mean, clearly now you have a problem, but my guess is you had enough information 10 years ago to know that too. It might not behoove you, and you might not be invested in that company long enough to actually do something with that, but it's important to actually think about that. And, I'm going to give you a perfect example in a second, because oftentimes I'll ask students, what are you surprised by? What have you been surprised by? And so inevitably, they might say they were surprised by Donald Trump's election in 2016. Most of them will say they were surprised by COVID. And I'll say, well, let me show you something. And so that's kind of what I'm going to do here, if that's okay with you, Jackie.
Absolutely.
And so this is a scenario example. And so clearly this is looks like a similar spike protein to COVID. For many of you that did business in Asia, you may remember the SARS epidemic, when offices in Hong Kong were effectively closed. People couldn't travel to China. I know I was doing business in China then, and it was a concern. And so this was a scenario exercise that Morgan Stanley went through in 2007, that basically said, okay, what happens if we have a case of avian flu? We have a big presence in Hong Kong, a lot of assets. How are we going to think about this? How can we prepare for something like this if it happens? How do we do this? And so oftentimes it takes a crisis to predict, to get people to think this way. They might not have done this before the SARS epidemic, but they did this for the avian flu. And I'm not going to take you through the whole planning exercise. I'm just going to show you the scenario. But the takeaway from this, the most important thing to realize is that COVID should not have been a surprise to anyone. We had plenty of evidence that there are things like this that had happened in the past, that things that could happen in the future. I mean, a more testing scenario would have been that I think people have done, and you might have seen these in articles, and sometimes they pop up now, actually even in present times, was what happens if it was actually a lab leak? What would the world have done? That's a scenario that you could run, and you could say to yourself, what would that do to a whole variety of things? That's just one way. But I'm just going to show you this. I'm just going to show you this exercise here. And so basically they came up with two axes, just like I had showed you before for the Denver water example. And these were very simply public response and global coordination. Not a whole lot different than what we talk about now when it comes to COVID. So global coordination would either be fast and efficient or slow and inadequate. And public response would either be panicked or it would be disciplined. I'll leave it up to you to choose the one that you thought we ended up in. But in many ways, it doesn't matter because in your case, remember, these things are ex ante, not ex post. You're trying to say to yourself, what would I do if the world looked like this? This is what Morgan Stanley was trying to do. And so clearly, if the world looked like London 77, where it was relatively disciplined and global coordination was fast and efficient, you probably wouldn't do a whole lot. You wouldn't worry so much about it. It would be contained. But if you had a world that was panicked and slow and inadequate, you would start to have a different response. And if you start looking at what they describe here, it sounds, my guess would be pretty familiar, right? Focus on treatment, not on containment. Virus does not seem to distinguish between rich and poor, healthy or weak. Antiviral drugs, stockpiles run up, people are hoarding stuff, self-agent. A true disaster scenario unfolds, we go into lockdown. And you can kind of see these are different ways to think about this. And so organizations could do this kind of planning. The problem is what happens if it doesn't show up again for another 13 years after this? What do? Oftentimes these things are buried in a drawer afterwards. And so my recommendation is this is a process and it's a mindset. And so ways that you can do that, you just go back and revisit it every 3 or 4 years and you can create some new scenarios. The Coast Guard did this very effectively after 9/11. So after 9/11, they needless to say, took on a whole lot more responsibility than they had before 9/11. And they didn't have necessarily the resources to do it, and they need to get more resources. And so they used scenarios to help them plan for that and to not only be able to get more resources, but people understand where they should be able to devote those resources. And so a way that you can kind of think about that. And I'm going to come back and show you how to do this in just a second. But that's kind of the way that you kind of can think about that.
Well, thank you, Hiram. And kind of building upon some of your comments from earlier, when do you recommend that we use scenario planning? And also, how far out should we be projecting these scenarios?
So I think a lot of this stuff will vary for you. So Jackie, I'm going to talk to you and you can ask questions, but I'm going to just show this slide that I have here because I think it will be helpful to people watching. And so hopefully they can see that. And so essentially is you take yourself, you're the user. Remember, scenarios are just for you. That's the most important thing. So if there's, 100 people on this, whatever, each of you will have your own scenarios and each of you will have your own use for it. These should not be duplicates. So even if you do this for a group of 5 of you, you would have, in essence, you'd have to pick one to do what that is. And that's what we do in our workshop when Up and I ran that course. Each team would pick one person and do a user for that. But if you think about this, you have 2 environments that you live in. There's a contextual environment and a transactional environment. And this relates to strategy too. And I think people now, when they think about politics and understand how politics shapes transactional environments, they understand how their business models may be impacted by changes in politics. And essentially, scenarios helps you do that. So you start with the contextual environment, and that's kind of where you do this, and you kind of just survey and appreciate it. And this could be all sorts of things. It could not only just be politics, oftentimes it's technology. Take AI, for example. And then you might say to yourself, what forces come out of this contextual environment and impact my transactional environment? And I'll show that to you. Your transactional environment generally are people that you can shake their hand with, things that you can talk to. And they're going to change that. And so you kind of start with the contextual environment. You then kind of map your transactional environment. And then you might say, how do those changes impact on your on what you want to do, depending on what the scenarios are. If we had another case of avian flu, for example, to Morgan Stanley, what will we do in each of those 4 scenarios? What will we have to do? And if you're doing business strategy, oftentimes you would kind of wind tunnel your strategy against these different scenarios, and you might build a little bit of what I would call kind of an option pool. Assets that weren't completely sunk necessarily, but assets that you could kind of shift different directions depending on how you identify the kind of what I call the gates to a new scenario or a different scenario, ways that you can think about that. And so if you look at this, what this happens to be an example for if you've been in London for TFL, this is for the two, but basically there, because they very much interact with the government, you can see the government is in their transactional environment. For most of us, the government is sort of in our transactional environment, but it's basically, we tend to be rule takers, not rule makers. And so oftentimes it would kind of be in the contextual environment. And so you would kind of do this. This happens to be for TFL, just to give an example. And then you kind of pick forces that come out of those. Those are called driving forces. They could be whatever you want them to be. They could be changes in the trade regime. They could be changes in geopolitical alliances. They could be changes in technology. Often they get mediated by different states, and different states have different scale and scope of their ability to kind of mediate those driving forces, ways that you can do that. And so you take those and you put these on that 2x2 that we saw, for example, and that's essentially how you go. And so what happens is when you map those onto this, you basically will get 4 scenarios. And I'm just going to show you that, and then Jackie, we can come and I'll take some questions and go from there. And so this just happens to be, something that I'd put together, but it could be anything. But this is a question of democracies flourish. This is very much a relevant question today: is are we moving into a world of autocracy or not? And how is economic well-being? But you could also toss in climate policy coordination or anything else that you might want to do. And you overlay these, and you might say, okay, now, can you picture a world where economic well-being is yes, and democracies flourish? Certainly, it's easy to picture that world. You might say to yourself, can you picture a world where democracies flourish and there's not economic well-being? You might say, how plausible is that? But I think we can very much imagine a world where democracies don't flourish and you have economic well-being. We've seen that world. And then you can also see, of course, where you have democracies don't flourish and not a lot of economic well-being. And we know lots of countries that have that. And that's sort of a way that you can kind of think about that, a way that you can kind of get there and say to yourself, how do I do that? And that's what scenarios do. It's an exercise. Think of it this way. If you had a pothole in the road, you drive over it, you feel it in your car. Well, can you imagine if you had a kind of a very good photograph of a pothole and you laid it over the pavement? You would also be able to, if you imagine it right, feel how it was driving over that pothole. And that's what scenarios are supposed to be, is you're putting potholes in your road and your ways that you can think about that. And so I'm going to come back to that, and we can take some questions, because I know we have about 10 minutes or so left. But hopefully, I know it's very quick, but hopefully it's a way for you to at least think about building ways to kind of think about an imagined future. Go back and think about Dr. Strangelove, and your output is just that. It's the story. I suppose you could do a video. You could probably even now use AI to create a video of a world that is. I wouldn't make it a world that's sort of fantasy, but it's a world that's plausible, and you could actually create that now and show that to people. And I think people would start to say, okay, well, in this world, what would I need to do? And sometimes it takes uncertain times where people feel uncertain, like now, to get people to think this way. And oftentimes the challenge is less about the uncertainty, because that's very much present in people's lives. But what happens is when certainty kind of creeps back in, because we know very, very, very much that the world is really both continuity and change, and that change is discontinuous. So.
No, well, thank you, Hiram. This is wonderful. So actually, going back to the slide you just had on the screen, a question from one of our audience members was, how do you recommend selecting the axes for the slide? How do you kind of think about those critically? Because it would seem plausible that they would have an impact on the outcome of your scenario planning success.
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical question. I'll go back to that slide and just show you this. So essentially, I assume they're talking about this question here, sort of what are the forces, or?
Well, yes, I guess how do you determine those forces you want to
Yeah,
add to your
you can use a variety of things. We use something called STEEP-M, which is sort of, social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and then M is the miscellaneous. And you just choose different forces that come from that. And, scenario planning, if it's done in a corporation, so Shell has used this for a long time. It was basically scenario planning that got Shell to be a very large oil and gas. So before there were oil embargo, which Shell scenarios actually predicted, and Shell was able to leverage that. They were, I don't know, the 7th or 8th largest oil major after the Arab oil embargo. They were the 2nd largest, and so Shell has sort of always used scenarios. Oftentimes, it could be luck. And my point is, you don't have to worry about being right or wrong. You just have to go through the exercise. So don't overthink it. The goal is not to kind of say, oh my gosh, I have this stuff. Yeah, I can see Teddy's using ChatGPT. You can use ChatGPT, Teddy. But remember that it's important to realize that ChatGPT is trained on a data set. And that data set is basically only going to take what stuff that's happened in the past. And your goal is to take your knowledge of Sloan and think about kind of system dynamics and think about, okay, if this is what happens, what are the second order effects? So ChatGPT is a great way to get you to stimulate your environment. I mean, often doing this in conjunction with other people, reading novels, seeing multiple ways that you can think about that. But the goal is not to worry about getting the forces right. The goal is to come up with a variety of forces, try them on. You can rip the scenarios up, toss them out. Find the ones that you think are going to be plausible and that particularly are going to resonate with the person that you're doing the scenarios for. If you're doing it in a company, and who do you want to show and show it to people in the C-suite? What do you want to do? It's important to kind of think about that.
So building upon that, Hiram, how do you ensure that this work isn't done in vain? How do you kind of ensure that it doesn't just sit in a drawer and people don't use it? What were your recommendations for that?
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of them sit in a drawer. So, of course, I'd say, come back, take an executive elective in January. So we did have, why do I say that? I laugh, but I say that because we had a student from Singapore, and when I was at Oxford, they have run a scenarios planning, and government in Singapore sends 4 or 5 people a year to Oxford for scenario planning. They literally do this everywhere throughout the government because Singapore is one of those small countries that has essentially developed in a what I would call a security-minded world. They kind of were kicked out by Malaysia back in the early 60s, and very much have kind of built that mentality around people. Taiwan is also a country like that. Israel, that sort of feel they're always under existential threat, and so they're able to do that. And Singapore, in particular, uses scenarios, as I'm sure those other countries do too, to do that. And so she kind of got in the habit of doing scenarios every 2 years and then put them in the drawer and forget about them. And I think that when we taught this course in January, I mean, we did this in 12 hours. And she said this was much more fun, much more way to do it. And so that's what I recommend is essentially you don't need to spend months like the people in Denver did and do this and then feel like once you do that, everyone feels like you're going to put them in some gold embossed folder and use them. The point is what's important is the manner of thinking. What Sloan has taught me and my guest has taught you is with system dynamics is feedback loops, reinforcing loops, stocks and flows. People often, if you think about what's happened politically, I often think that people forget that not only is resentment a flow, but it's a stock. And so oftentimes there is this resentment among a certain part of the population that kind of just built up over time, 10, 20, 30 years. And then it gets to a point where that's as much as it can do and it becomes a tipping point. And so kind of taking your Sloan education, that's why people that go to Sloan, I think, are better prepared for this world. But if you have an system dynamics and we teach scenarios, I have to teach a little bit of kind of stocks and flows. It's as simple as using the bathtub or the water in the bathtub. But if you can think about that, that's a way that you can do that. And the mental model is what allows you to keep this thing and not throw it in the drawer. And, this is the Andy Grove, be paranoid kind of mentality. But I think it's a healthy it's a healthy attitude to have at all times. I don't want to drive you crazy, but it also makes life more interesting. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for tying that into kind of the overall kind of perspective of MIT too. It's incredibly helpful. I think as a final and closing thoughts, we only have a couple of minutes left. Certainly, in addition to being a professor at MIT, you also received your MBA and PhD from MIT, as Greg noted in the beginning. So, from these experiences, could you kind of share a final takeaway as it kind of relates to our discussion today that you'd like to leave with the audience?
I'm trying to, give you the sales pitch here, of course. I don't think I need to, I'm preaching to the converted, my guess would be, wouldn't be on this. But I think that in many ways, this kind of mind in hand thing is that mens humanus that MIT has and always pushes upon us. And, I think action learning became much more, a much larger part of Sloan as time has gone on. And so I don't know when people have graduated from, but that kind of, prospect of getting out in the world and kind of being both in theory and in practice is important. Ways that you can do that. And so I happen to be working on capital markets and a manufacturing project now. And I've also worked in manufacturing in the past, and in my previous life, I've owned a couple of manufacturers. And in many ways, manufacturing embodies MIT because it's something that you work with your hands and something that you need your mind to do. And what makes Sloan special is we understand that we do that. And so I think the challenge always for Sloanies is to get across the whole institute and to go and see everything. And my encouragement to you as someone that's back on campus is if you have the opportunity and you're in Cambridge, don't just come to Sloan. Go around the institute, see what's going on, understand what faculty and researchers are doing, and think about that ways that can impact your community. I mean, we always give the pitch on principled and innovative leaders because that sounds good, but in reality, a lot of our students go into finance and consulting, and so the goal is ultimately those are very, very important. Finance is important, but it's important because it also finances industry. And that's what makes MIT so special is we combine those things. Consulting, oftentimes folks that come from Sloan and go in consulting then go on and run their own businesses or start their own company. And so I think it's important to kind of think through the kind of MIT ethos, which quite frankly is different from any other school that I know of. It's also very American in the sense that it's very entrepreneurial. You do have to put up with, sometimes you have to do this on your own. You have to kind of sort of do things first and ask for permission later. And so all within reasonable measure are things that I think that Sloan teaches you, that certainly MIT teaches you. And, someone that teaches global things, I think Sloan, my hope is Sloan will continue to be more and more global. And that I think MIT has a lot to not only offer the United States, but to offer the world. And we have a tremendous amount of people that have come from around the world to MIT. And so, I just encourage you to stay invested in education at every level, wherever you are, whether for yourself or for your employees or your community, because I think it's important to do that. And the more you are, the more comfortable you'll be with things like AI and a variety of our new technologies coming on.
And that's a perfect way to close. Hiram, thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic. We really appreciate it. Greg, I'll turn it over to you for a few final thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Hiram. Jackie, thank you for your time today. For our audience, thank you for joining us. When you close out of the session today, you will see a survey appear on your screen. So please fill that out and let us know your feedback on today's session. As we've noted, we will share the slides and the recording following the session, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Coming up on May 19th, we'll have Ray Rothrock, philanthropist and venture capitalist, on the program. Please plan to join us. Thank you so much again. Take care, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you, everyone.